Hello and welcome to the Tuesday, May 5th, 2015 Fiscal Committee meeting. We'll call the meeting to order. First, we need a motion to approve the minutes from our meeting held February 2nd, 2015.
So move, Anderson.
Second. Barsky.
Those motions have been made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Very good. Thank you. We'll move right into our reports and updates. Dave Bixler, I believe, is going to and Jim David both are going to present a public facility ticketing fee.
Good afternoon, Jim David, Legislative Operations Manager for the City Council. 2 weeks ago, the Audit Committee had requested that this committee review this ordinance, which is 41-008. This is a fee that is applied to all city-owned facilities that provide either entertainment or sporting events, with the exception of those facilities that are 2,500 seats or less. And this impacts the Canary Stadium, the Premier Center, the Arena, and the Sioux Falls Convention Center. This ticket fee is based on whether or not the event is for professional sports and also the ticket price. According to the audit report, professional sport tickets should be based on the structure that is in number 2, but due to some confusing language, there was one team that did operate under number 1. This ordinance also requires that the fees be remitted, or the revenue that's generated from this fee be remitted to the city within 60 days. And as was reported during the informational meeting, this is not happening. A meeting was conducted about a little over a week ago. It included Councilor Christine Erickson, Finance Director Tracy Turbach, Chris Semra, Kelly Zamora, both with Premier Center SMG, Matt Ferguson, Sioux Falls Canaries, Dave Bixler, the Council's budget analyst, and myself. And we looked at some of the audit recommendations, specifically these 3 items included in their recommendation. First is to simplify the fee structure or allow operators discretion when working with promoters. The second item is to ensure that there is no conflicting words between agreements and with the operators in the ordinance. And then third, enforce or revise the wording in the ordinance that requires operators to remit fees to the city within 60 days. This does not, we did not address anything within the agreements themselves. So the changes you have in front of you basically tries to simplify the ordinance by making sure that it is clear that subsection A is no longer valid after October 1st, 2015, and this date was worked out with the Sioux Falls Canaries when their season does end. In section 2, it does reiterate that that is going to begin for season tickets beginning on October 1st, 2015. Also in subsection C, it says that the fees for all other admissions shall be directed by the operator or the manager of the facility as long as they consult with the city's finance director. But the fee shall not exceed $3. And this is based on a reason that you might have at the Premier Center a concert, or you could have a home show, or maybe some other type of a show. So there's diversity, and this right here provides that flexibility to the manager of that facility. It also allows them to negotiate with promoters of concerts. The other change that was made was in subsection D, and this is just allowing for that the money, it's already existing, that it's deposited in the general fund within 60 days. However, it does allow that if there is a disagreement within the agreement with a manager within a lease agreement, that it defaults to that lease agreement. And as was reported in the informational, this did happen with SMG and the Premier Center. So this allows the agreement to trump what's in ordinance. We do have representatives of some of those entities. They are present today. We also have Finance Director Tracy Turbach and Rick's also with the Auditor's Office, but I would happy to entertain any of your questions.
Any questions for Jim?
Well, I guess one for Jim, from a legislative perspective. The question came up during the informational meeting about noncompliance. There is no penalty for not remitting the money. Has there been a thought put into what can be done there, or a reason to or not to do that?
Yeah, we did not discuss that in our meeting. We didn't address that within this ordinance. I know I think it was briefly discussed during the audit committee meeting, but we did not talk about the any enforcement of the ordinance. I'm sure within the agreements with SMG or with the owners of the Sioux Falls Canaries that is addressed within their agreement, a breach of contract, but in the ordinance we did not address that.
Councilor Anderson.
Okay, so right now we have in the ordinance that the monies are supposed to be remitted to the city within 60 days, correct?
Correct.
Are any of these entities doing that right now?
I'm going to have to defer to the finance director, Tracy, on that. So,
Tracy Turback with the Finance Office. In the case of the Canaries, they remit once a year. That I think goes back to the provision in their agreement where they get an offset or a credit against their annual lease payment, and they've got an annual lease payment that's due, and they utilize that credit then to offset on that payment in addition to their fees that they pay. But no, they don't remit every 60 days. In the case of the event center and the arena and the convention center, under the management agreement that SMG operates under, those dollars stay within their operating account. And so they collect them the time the tickets are sold, and they stay right in that operating account. So, I mean, it depends on how you look at that. They don't remit them. They don't write the city a check, and we don't send money back to them, which was kind of the practice in the past. But those are city dollars, so the city essentially has ownership of them.
If I may?
Yes.
Tracy, you're saying those are city dollars. During the time that they have the partial control of those city dollars, are they able to spend those dollars for things without informing us, or do they have to inform us if they're going to do any expenditures from that fund?
Although the dollars don't go into any separate fund, they go into the general operating account for the facilities. So they've got an operating budget that they operate under, and they certainly report to us every month kind of how those dollars are coming in on the revenue side, how they're being spent on the expenditure side, including those things that are spent for building maintenance and upkeep and repairs and that kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Erickson.
I just want to state that the intent to some of the change here, I know that the pavilion currently does charge, the pavilion's a city-owned facility, and they do charge a facility fee, but they were specifically exempted in the past, and so the intent was to have all city-owned property included in here, so also including the Orpheum as well as the pavilion. But I would say the intent to that is to allow the pavilion to continue to charge what they're charging, have them fall under this ordinance, and use it for their operating as well as what they're currently doing. And that's why the clause at the end had said, unless otherwise directed in the management agreement or lease. So that allows the flexibility of them to be able to charge it, keep it in their account, to be able to use for maintenance on their building, as well as SMG uses it for operating as well.
Very good. I just have a thought that I wasn't able to be at the audit committee hearing when that occurred, or I haven't watched it, or I received, heard the report that Rich just gave earlier. But the thought to me is that these fees that are collected and paid for by the public that are attending the events really has been, at least from probably our perspective, not really known about or seen, quantified in a way that the public knows that, did you know that by participating and attending these public buildings that the city owns, you have helped fund $300,000 worth of improvements that all those individuals who don't use the facilities you've helped offset that cost to the rest of the city, so to speak. Somehow that should be clearer. And I think if we certainly bring it into the operating budgets of each of those entities, each one is then essentially individually quantified on how much they've returned back. I just think we need to do maybe a better job of somehow displaying that to the rest of the city so they all see that the money is getting used, how it's getting used, and which way. Yes, Councilor Erickson.
And maybe, Chris, if from SMG, if you'd maybe want to come up and on the ticket, it is listed out and it has a code on there. This is a common practice from all really facilities really charge this as well. So maybe if you just want to maybe answer maybe a couple of his questions or how it's on the tickets, how it's separated as far as what you've seen in the past.
Sure. Good evening, Mr. Chairman and councilors. It is very standard practice to apply facility fees as we're doing in Sioux Falls. It is a quantifiable number that could have a total at the end of the year. As Mr. Turbeck said, it is part of the operating revenue that goes into SMG, like many other ones we do. We typically don't break other ones out and promote the total, but it could be done and easily quantified here. Did I answer that one?
Yeah. And when I first heard I will say when I heard at the audit, I was kind of surprised going, oh my gosh, I didn't know, what are we charging? I didn't know we did this. Why are we doing this? What more are we adding on the ticket prices? And I was a little bit frustrated in the beginning, to be quite honest. And then as I looked into this and noticed how all the other facilities do it and how you have other facilities in town that are non-city owned buildings that charge this currently in Sioux Falls as well, to help recoup some of their just operating expenses, their annual operating expenses. I just don't think it's maybe publicized, but since it is public dollars, to have a number at the end of the year is not, I think, out of the norm to ask for. And if that's something that is important to us to kind of gauge going forward of what it's doing, and especially with the new event center, how much more is it bringing in a year? Because I think this $300,000 you're going to see skyrocket with all of our facilities and all of our tickets and the number of seats, et cetera.
Councilor Karski.
$300,000 in the past years, but I mean, we're looking at basically doubling these fees now. So I mean, it could be $500,000-$600,000. I guess I'd like to hear from Director Turbach the wisdom or maybe the logic in keeping it in the general fund and not separated, so that we can account for that money and how it's used. And it's going to become a very significant source of revenue. Is there a better way to account for it or to hold this money, Tracy?
I think and incidentally, the most of the tickets are assessed a $2 fee. I think a good portion of that revenue comes from the $2 level of fees. Anything that's $30 or more, which would cover almost all the concerts at the event center, for example, would be subject to that $2 fee. So it wouldn't be quite doubling that if the decision was made to go all the way to $3. And again, I don't think that's the intention right out of the chute, but there's a $3 level would allow some flexibility without having to come back and amend the ordinance within the next few years to bump it up another quarter or 50 cents. In terms of the accounting for it, I think it makes perfect sense to do it the way we're doing it today with SMG, where those dollars go into the operating account. That was part of the discussion, I know, when the decision was made to move forward with the event center project and to find ways for those people that are using the facility, that are attending events, to again help support the cost of operating that facility and keeping it up going forward. And so by those dollars going into that operating account that are generated from events at those venues, that it seems to me that makes very good sense. And they're accounted for. SMG's financial reports identify those revenues very specifically. So I think that's a very good approach. In the case of the baseball stadium, our business relationship is a little different with the Canaries than it is with SMG. The Canaries are essentially a tenant in the city facility, and we as a city owner, take a lot more active role in maintaining and keeping that facility up. So in that case, I think it makes sense for those fees to come to the city general fund, which helps support the Parks and Rec budget, who is the department that is responsible for assisting in keeping that facility up. So I think the draft language in the ordinance allows either one of those, depending on the circumstances for a particular facility.
So for me to get this clear in my mind, under Section D, and it says, and deposited in the general fund of the city, and then in blue, the change, unless directed otherwise in the management agreement or lease. So are we saying that all of our management agreement and leases with SMG and so forth allow them to keep it in their operating fund?
The SMG agreement does, yes.
Okay. Is that typical of all of them or most of them, or?
The only other one that we have really where that's covered by this ordinance would be the stadium.
Okay.
And we don't have an operating agreement with the Canaries. It's more of a lease agreement where they've got the right to occupy and use the facility. But they aren't responsible so much as managing it as SMG is with the other facilities.
So,
in the case of the pavilion, of course, we've got an operating agreement with them. They're not technically covered by this ordinance today based on that 2,500 seat limit.
So the part where it says and deposited in the general fund of the city is somewhat redundant because it's going to stay in the operating budget anyway?
Well, I think when the internal audit looked at that, they considered the general fund of the city to be what we use with a capital G as our general fund operating budget. The operating account for the event center and the convention center are not part of our general fund budget. They are part of the funds of the city, but they're not within that part of the budget. So I think the language that's been added would be permissive, so that the default would be that those dollars come to the city and they do go into our general fund budget as an operating revenue. However, if we've got an operating agreement that provides otherwise that they would be used for that particular facility, then that would be allowed now under this new language.
Thank you.
Councilor Anderson.
Tracy, you stated that the baseball contract is different, where we're basically the baseball organization is a tenant, but isn't the contract structured to where they basically have control of that facility?
They do have a lot of rights under that tenant lease agreement, yeah, or stadium agreement, I believe it's
And
called.
what is SMG's part in this? Do they just handle the concessions, or are they any part of this contract for the stadium? Do they?
SMG is not involved in that.
Okay, so it's all done through the baseball management then? They handle the concessions, ticket sales, things like that?
My understanding is that the Canaries have an agreement with Ovations, and Ovations actually, under a contract with the Canaries, does the concessions at the stadium. The city nor SMG don't have a part of that in the case of the baseball stadium.
So then the baseball organization does act like a management group out there?
Well, they've got the right to put on their games and to sell concessions if that's what they choose to do. So they've got, as I say, a lot of rights, but they don't necessarily they don't operate on behalf of the city like SMG does with the other venues.
So like if we decided to, you may not be ready to speak to this, but like, let's say if we found an entity that wanted to do naming rights on the stadium, where would, with the naming rights that we do for the event center, and that all goes into a large fund for operations, and how would that do with the baseball stadium?
I'm not sure if the agreement between the city and the Canaries addresses that particular question or not. If it doesn't, then I would think it would be up to, it would purely be within the city's rights to sell those naming rights. But I can't answer on that.
Right, I would think there was a naming rights.
There is a naming rights agreement in the contract. The money goes to the baseball organization.
But I mean, even a city ordinance, isn't there a public?
There is a naming ordinance that the council adopted a couple of years ago, yeah.
I think that's a great idea, Councilor Anderson. That's just a jewel that's sitting out there waiting for somebody to Anderson Stadium. Well, Councilor Erickson.
Sorry, I misspoke before, and I just wanted to make a point of clarification. I gave each of you an amendment that I was looking at, and then I talked as if I had already given it out, and it didn't match the screen, so my apologies. So I just want to step back a couple feet and address that amongst ourselves here to see if there's consensus with this. So backing up, Pavilion currently charges a facility fee, and it's a city-owned facility, but they do not remit it to the city. They absorb it. There is no, in my opinion, we don't see it, and I understand that's the way the ordinance is written. So what my amendment that I had laid at your desk removes the having a fixed seating capacity in excess of 2,500 persons. And what that would do is allow the pavilion still to charge their facility fee, and based on a management agreement, allow them to still absorb and use that. But it would be, if for some reason that management company then decided to cut ties with the city, it would be our asset at that time, since they are collecting that. But to continue to let them operate the way that they're doing, but it's just kind of for future reference, so we wouldn't have to change this again should anything change in the future. And then it also allows SMG, who also manages the Orpheum, to charge that facility fee as well on Orpheum tickets, because they can't do it right now because we had that magical 2,500 seats in there. So that's what you have at your desk, and my apologies for misspeaking before. But I would just kind of maybe gauge your opinions if that's something that you can see being valuable or not, or just see if there's any other discussion on that.
Right, so what, do any of the other committee members think that removing the 2,500 person seat is a problem, or must have been in there for a reason? And I would suspect for those smaller venues that they wouldn't be strapped with a higher fee per ticket, I suppose, was really the thought behind it. But
Chair?
yes, Councilor.
I see that we have Larry Toll from the Pavilion here. Maybe we could ask him, maybe he has some knowledge on how this was done.
The Honorable Larry Toll. Welcome.
Good evening, councilors. Larry Toll at the Washington Pavilion. My understanding was the 2,500 was put in to exempt us originally. And so when we have a facility fee that we charge, and as Chris said, it's standard in the industry to have that as part of your cost recovery. So when we have a show come in, that's part of the cost when we go to settlement with the show to recover that. Last year that totaled $164,000 for the pavilion, and that flows right to our bottom line. Scott Peterson and I, my co-president, will be back here next week at your 4 o'clock meeting to show you the impact of that, and let me guarantee you that we need that money to be able to keep afloat. So I would like to look at the management agreement closer to make sure that if you enact Councilor Erickson's amendment, that it has no impact on us. But Jim David may talk to that too, but we'd like to take a look at that just to see where it's at.
Thank you, Councilor Anderson.
I guess my only question on that is, when you account for that, does it just fall into your general fund, or do you actually have a bracket that will say where this revenue is coming from, and then?
I mean, in our we track where it is, but in our statements it will come under general revenues, ticketing revenues, admission revenues.
Okay. And if I can speak to that, I think that compiled with what Councilor Erickson's trying to do, I would like to see just more of a general accounting for that, so that it's easier when we do any audits or anything like that, we can see what is generating. I don't want to take it away from any of the facilities. I just want to, right, and I believe that's Councilor Erickson's intention also, is we don't want to take it away. We just want to make sure that we can account for, what's generating from these fees. And by just placing them in the general fund, we're not really able to see that. But I think with that, the way SMG, the way Tracy had stated it, SMG does do an accounting of that. And if the other facilities did the same, I would have no problem with this.
Right, I think the only other thing to think about then is, in relation to the amendment, is to think about the future and other facilities that might get built, a small outdoor pavilion that is being considered. There's no essential setup seating, but things like that, where there's tickets sold to an event, perhaps. Anyway, I see it harmless as well, just from my perspective so far. And in all fairness, all the work that's been done and the with Jim and Dave, I think is pretty well done. The amendment seems harmless, so for me, I'm okay so far. Councilor Karski.
Yes.
In looking at this, I'm seeing the fee as a way of funding the cost of doing business. And again, I don't know if we're micromanaging, if we ask them to account for it or where to put it, or Larry and his group, having accountability to us for it. It's their fee as a way of offsetting their cost of doing business. It doesn't belong to the city. It's part of our agreement, operating agreement with the Washington Pavilion. I don't see any harm. I don't see a benefit in it. But I guess when we look at the bottom line of what are these fees accomplishing and what are we doing with them, it's a management tool to offset operating costs, and I don't think it's probably negotiated with the whoever's the promoter of the show that's coming to town. They don't have anything to do with that fee. Is that correct?
It is negotiable.
It is negotiated?
But it's a standard fee in the industry.
Okay. So I could go either way. It really doesn't bother me if we take it or not, because I don't see where by removing it we're going to be actually able to account for it or have it accountable to us. So maybe I'm not understanding it completely, but.
Councilor Erickson.
I will just say that my concern with why it should be accounted is it's public funds. So I think that it's our duty to account for it, even if some crazy thing would happen and SMG is gone. Those are our funds. We can go back and it's our asset. And so for us to be able to account for public facility fee 1, and they up and leave us high and dry, which is not going to happen. I don't think so. It's just a balance for us protecting those public funds. That's my concern. That makes me feel better.
And with SMG, I agree completely, and we're covering them by having it over $2,500. But with the Washington Pavilion, I don't know what, as Mr. Toll said, with the our agreement, our management agreement with their group on the Washington Pavilion, how that is addressed. And until we know, it really doesn't matter, I don't.
But they can amend their agreements as well to make it, that was kind of the intent, is to allow the agreements to be amended if they need to be.
Councilor Anderson.
The other thing on this too is that now we could have an open discussion on the things that are being done with these public funds, instead of them just being, just as Mr. Toll just stated here, it was nice to know that these funds are being utilized for, improvements at the pavilion and things like that. Like I said, again, we're not asking them, or trying to take the money from them. We're just asking for a little better accounting of that, of this fund here. So, and once again, even in the beginning of this, except for the having fixed seating of excess of 2,500 people, these funds were supposed to be collected and turned into the city. So, and we do a lot of things for pass-through that we have to account for, and I just think that it's best business practice to make sure we're accounting of this fund here, because it is separate from, you know, your general ticket fees and things like that, and we account for each of those. So I just don't think that this is out of hand or micromanaging. It's just wanting to know what fund is generating what revenue and what that revenue is being utilized for.
Councilor Karski.
If I could ask this question of Larry, when you, in those years where you do have an operating profit, that money stays within your operating fund, correct?
Yes.
And if we were to do this, that money would have to come out of your operating fund and be transferred back to the city?
Well, I didn't take as close a look at our operating agreement to know if that's the case or not. And I think that's where I'd like to spend, I want to look at the operating agreement to say, where does it? Because today, everything is funded out of the entertainment tax. And this, obviously, if it were to go into general funds, then there might, you know, we would basically say, we need an offset for that. And so, you know, that would be the only, I'd like to look at the operating agreement to see what it says, to make sure that this doesn't have an impact on us.
Okay. And I'm going to suggest then, based on that, that the amendment has merit, there's no doubt, but I don't think it has to be sent to the council with that amendment in there, and it can be added when after Larry does his homework and can report back to the council, when we vote on this as part of our enforcement or making it apply, I guess.
If I could, with all due respect to the committee and the people who have attended today, we do have the 7 o'clock meeting. We've been asked for 15 minutes prior to that to start. I think there's other discussion points that haven't been covered yet. The rates, are they the appropriate rates? And just other issues that have been brought up here. I hate to see this get rushed out of the committee. The start date, October 1st, is that the right date? Things like that. If we could, would you be okay to review this again at our next fiscal committee meeting? I don't know the staff.
I think that would be appropriate.
Is that okay? Nobody's under the gun. So let's do that. And if you don't, and is there any other open discussion items that others would want to bring up today? Well, then I'll take a motion to adjourn if we could.
So moved.
Second.
Those motions have been made and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.